Hello, everyone. This is my second recording of my reading of Small Gods, and I decided to just make it a video because it's easier this way. I just reduced the frame rate. As you can see, it's at like 24 movie quality, so that should reduce the file size. I also decreased the video size because this is mostly just for you guys to listen to. But anyway, yeah, sorry for the small hiatus there. I like fell out of it for a while, even though it's not that hard to read a book, especially a book that I really like. You can see that this is very well worn because I have read this book a lot. But yes, anyway, let's get back into it, and I hope you enjoy part 2 of Small Gods. Thank you so much for joining me here. I was trying to get it so you could hear me like turning the pages, but it's a very small noise, so I'd have to figure that out later. Or like add it in. I don't know. We'll worry about that later. You guys can always tell me what you think about that kind of thing. Anyway, enough pretense. Let's get back to it. Many feel they are called to the priesthood, but what they really hear is an inner voice saying, "It's indoor work with no heavy lifting. Do you want to be a plowman like your father?" Whereas Brutha didn't just believe, he really believed. That's capitalized, by the way. That sort of thing is usually embarrassing when it happens in a God-fearing family, but all Brutha had was his grandmother, and she believed too. She believed like iron believes in metal. She was the kind of woman every priest dreads in a congregation, the one who knows all the chants, all the sermons. In the Omnian Church, women were allowed in the temple only on sufferance, and had to keep absolutely silent and well covered up in their own section behind the pulpit, in case the sight of one half of the human race caused the male members of the congregation to hear voices not unakin to those that plagued Brother Numrod through every sleeping and waking hour. The problem was that Brutha's grandmother had the kind of personality that can protect itself through a lead sheet and a bitter piety with the strength of a diamond-bit auger. If she had been born a man, Omnianism would have found its 8th prophet rather earlier than expected. As it was, she organized the temple cleaning, statue polishing, and the stoning of suspected adulteresses, Rhodas, with a terrible efficiency. So Brutha grew up in the sure and certain knowledge of the great god Om. Brutha grew up knowing that Om's eyes were on him at all time, especially in places like the Privy, and that demons assailed him on all sides and were only kept at bay by the strength of his belief and the weight of his grandmother's cane, which was kept behind the door on those rare occasions when it was not being used. He could recite every verse in all 7 books of the prophets and every single precept. He knew all the laws and the songs, especially the laws. The Omnians were a God-fearing people. They had a great deal to fear. Vorbis's room was in the upper citadel, which was unusual for a mere deacon. He hadn't asked for it. He seldom had to ask for anything. Destiny has a way of marking her own. He also got visited by some of the most powerful men in the church's hierarchy. And not, of course, the 6 archpriests or the Cenobiarch himself. They weren't that important. They were merely at the top. The people who really run organizations are usually found several levels down, where it's still possible to get things done. People like to be friends with Vorbis, mainly because of the aforesaid mental field, which suggested to them, in the subtlest ways, that they didn't want to be his enemy. 2 of them were sitting down with him now. They were General Friet, who, whatever the official records might suggest, was the man who ran most of the Divine Legion, and Bishop Druna, secretary to the Congress of Iams. People might not think that much of a position of power, but then they'd never been minute secretary to a meeting of slightly deaf old men. Neither man was in fact there. They were not talking to Vorbis. It was one of those kinds of meetings. Lots of people didn't talk to Vorbis and went out of their way not have meetings with him. Some of the abbots from the distant monasteries had recently been summoned to the citadel, traveling secretly for up to a week across torturous terrain, just so they definitely wouldn't join the shadowy figures visiting Vorbis's room. In the last few months, Vorbis had apparently had about as many visitors as the man in the iron mask. Nor were they talking, but But if they had been there, and if they had been having a conversation, it would have gone like this. And now, said Vorbis, the matter of Ephebe. Bishop Druna shrugged, or would have done if he had been there, but he wasn't, so he couldn't. Of no consequence, they say. No threat. The two men looked at Vorbis, a man who never raised his voice. It was very hard to tell what Vorbis was thinking, often even after he had told you. Really? Is that what we've come to, he said? No threat? After what they did to poor brother Murdoch? The insults to Ulm? This must not pass. What is proposed to be done? No more fighting, said Friet. They fight like madmen. No, we've lost too many already. They have strong gods, said Druna. They have better bows, said Friet. There is no god but Ulm, said Vorbis. What the Ephebians believe they worship are nothing but jinns and demons. If it can be called worship. Have you seen this? He pushed forward a scroll of paper. What is it? Said Friet cautiously. A lie. A history that does not exist and never existed. The things. Vorbis hesitated, trying to remember a word that had long since fallen into disuse, like the tales told to children who are too young. Words for people to say the... Oh, a play, said Friet. Vorbis's gaze nailed him to the wall. You know of these things? When I traveled to Clatch once, Friet stuttered. He visibly pulled himself together. He had commanded 100,000 men in battle. He didn't deserve this. He found he didn't dare look at Vorbis's expression. They dance dances, he said limply, on their holy days. The women have bells on their... and sing songs. All about the early days of the worlds, when the gods... He faded. It was disgusting, he said. He clicked his knuckles, a habit of his whenever he was worried. This one has their gods in it, said Vorbis. Men in masks. Can you believe that? They have a god of wine, a drunken old man, and the people say Ephebe is no threat. And this, he tossed another, thicker scroll on the table. This is far worse. For while they worship false gods in error, their error is in their choice of gods, not in their worship. But this... Druna gave it a cautious examination. I believe there are other copies, even in the Citadel, said Vorbis. This one belonged to Sasho. I believe you recommended him to my service, Friet. He always struck me as an intelligent and keen young man, said the general. But disloyal, said Vorbis, and now receiving his just reward. It is only to be regretted that he has not been induced to give us the names of his fellow heretics. Friet fought against the sudden rush of relief. His eyes met those of Vorbis. Druna broke the silence. De Shalonian mobile, he said. The turtle moves. What does that mean? Even telling you could put your soul at risk of 1,000 years in hell, said Vorbis. His eyes had not left Friet, who was now staring fixedly at the wall. I think it's a risk we might carefully take, said Druna. Vorbis shrugged. The writer claims that the world travels through the void on the back of 4 huge elephants, he said. Druna's mouth dropped open. On the back, he said. It is claimed, said Vorbis, still watching Friet. What do they stand on? The writer says they stand on the shell of an enormous turtle, said Vorbis. Druna grilled nervously. And what does that stand on, he said. I see no point in speculating as to what it stands on, snapped Vorbis, since it does not exist. Of course, said Druna quickly. It was only idle curiosity. Most curiosity is, said Vorbis. It leads the mind into speculative ways. Yet the man who wrote this walks around free in Ephebe now. Druna stared at the scroll. He says here he went on a ship that sailed to an island on the edge, and he looked over and... Lies, said Vorbis evenly. And it would make no difference even if they were not lies. Truth lies within, not without. In the words of the great god Om, as delivered through his chosen prophets, our eyes may deceive us, but our God never will. But... Vorbis looked at Friet. The general was sweating. Yes, he said. Well, Ephebe, a place where madmen have mad ideas. Everyone knows that. Maybe the wisest course is to leave them to stew in their folly. Vorbis shook his head. Unfortunately, wild and unstable ideas have a disturbing tendency to move around and take hold. Friet had to admit this was true. He knew from experience that true and obvious ideas, such as the ineffable wisdom and judgment of the great god Ohm, seemed so obscure to many people that you actually had to kill them before they saw the error of their ways, whereas dangerous and nebulous and wrong-headed notions often had such an attraction for some people that they would... He rubbed a scar thoughtfully. Hide up in the mountains and throw rocks at you until you starve them out. They'd prefer to die rather than see sense. Friet had seen sense at an early age. He had seen it was sense not to die. What do you propose? He said. The council wants to parley with Phoebe, said Druna. You know I have to organize a deputation to leave tomorrow. How many soldiers? Said Vorbis. Bodyguard only. We've only been guaranteed safe passage after all, said Friet. We have been guaranteed safe passage, said Vorbis. It sounded like a lengthy curse. And once inside? Friet wanted to say, I've spoken to the commander of the amphibian garrison. I think he's a man of honor, although, of course, he is indeed a despicable infidel and lower than worms. But it was not the kind of thing he felt it was wise to say to Vorbis. He substituted, we shall be on guard. Can we surprise them? Friet hesitated. We? He said. I shall lead the party, said Vorbis. There was the briefest exchange of glances between himself and the secretary. I would like to be away from the citadel for a while. A change of air. Besides, we should not let the Ephebians think they merit the attentions of a superior member of the church. I was just musing as to the possibility should we be provoked. Friet's nervous click was like a whip crack. We have given them our word. There is no truce with unbelievers, said Vorbis. But there are practical considerations, said Friet, as sharply as he dared. The palace of Ephebe is a labyrinth, I know. There are traps. No one gets in without a guide. How does the guide get in? Said Vorbis. I assume he guides himself, said the general. In my experience, there is always another way, said Vorbis. Into everything there is always another way, which the god will show in his own good time. We can be assured of that. Certainly matters would be easier if there was a lack of stability in Phoebe, said Druna. It does indeed harbor certain elements. And it will be the gateway to the whole of the Turnwise coast, said Vorbis. Well, the gel and then the sort, said Vorbis. Druna tried to avoid seeing Friet's expression. It is our duty, said Vorbis, our holy duty. We must not forget poor brother Murdoch. He was unarmed and alone. Brutha's sandals flip-flopped obediently along the stone-flagged corridor towards Brother Numrod's barren cell. He tried composing messages in his head. Master, there's a tortoise who says, Master, this tortoise wants... Master, guess what? I heard from this tortoise in the melons that... Brutha would have never dared to think of himself as a prophet, but he had a shrewd idea of the outcome of any interview that began in this way. Many people assumed that Brutha was an idiot. He looked like one, from his round, open face to his splayed feet and knock ankles. He also had a habit of moving his lips while he thought deeply, as if he was rehearsing every sentence. And this was because that was what he was doing. Thinking was not something that came easily to Brutha, or me either, honestly. Most people think automatically, thoughts dancing through their brains like static electricity across a cloud. At least, that's how it seemed to him. Whereas he had to construct thoughts a bit at a time, like someone building a wall. A short lifetime of being laughed at for having a body like a barrel and feet that gave the impression they were about to set out in opposite directions had given him a strong tendency to think very carefully about anything he said. Brother Numrod was prostrate on the floor in front of the statue of Om, trampling the ungodly, with his fingers in his ears. The voices were troubling him again. Brutha coughed. He coughed again. Brother Numrod raised his head. Brother Numrod? Said Brutha. What? Brother Numrod? What? Brother Numrod unplugged his ears. Yes, he said testily. There's something you ought to see. In the garden, Brother Numrod. The Master of Novices sat up. Brutha's face was a glowing picture of concern. What do you mean? Brother Numrod said. In the garden. It's hard to explain. I found out where the voices were coming from, Brother Numrod, and you did say to be sure to tell you. The old priest gave Brutha a sharp look, but if ever there was a person without guile or any subtlety, it was Brutha. Fear is strange soil. Mainly it grows obedience like corn, which grows in rows and makes weeding easy, but sometimes it grows the potatoes of defiance, which flourish underground. The Citadel had a lot of underground. There were the pits and the tunnels of the Quisition. There were cellars and sewers, forgotten rooms, dead-end spaces behind ancient walls, even natural caverns in the bedrock itself. This was such a cave. Smoke from the fire in the middle of the floor found its way out through a crack in the roof, and eventually into the maze of uncountable chimneys and light wells above. There were dozens of figures in the dancing shadows. They wore rough hoods over nondescript clothes, crude things made of rags, nothing that couldn't easily be burned after the meeting so that the wandering fingers of the Quisition would find nothing incriminating. Something about the way most of them moved suggested men who were used to carrying weapons. Here and there, clues, a stance, a turn of the word. On the wall of the cave there was a drawing. It was vaguely oval, with 3 little extensions at the top, the middle one slightly the largest of the 3, and 3 at the bottom, the middle one of these slightly longer and more pointed. A child's drawing of a turtle. Of course he'll go to Phoebe, said a mask. He won't dare not to. He'll have to dam the river of truth at its source. We must bail out what we can then, said another mask. We must kill Vorbis! Not in a Phoebe. When that happens, it must happen here, so that the people will know when we're strong enough. When will it ever be strong enough, said a mask. Its owner clicked his knuckles nervously. Ooh, does that sound familiar? Even the peasants know there's something wrong. You can't stop the truth. Damn the river of truth. Then there are leaks of great force. Didn't we find out about Murdoch? Ha! Killed in a Phoebe, Vorbis said. One of us must really go to a Phoebe and save the master, if he really exists. He exists, his name is on the book. Didactylos, strange name, it means two-fingered, you know? They must honor him in a Phoebe. Bring him back here if possible, and the book. One of the masks seemed hesitant, his knuckles clicked again. But will people really rally behind a book? People need more than a book. They're peasants, they can't read, but they can listen. Even so, they need to be shown, they need a symbol. We have one! Instinctively, every masked figure turned to look at the drawing on the wall, indistinct in the firelight, but graven on their minds. They were looking at the truth, which can often impress. The turtle moves. The turtle moves! The turtle moves! The leader nodded. And now, he said, we will draw lots. The great god Ohm waxed wroth, or at least made a spirited attempt. There's a limit to the amount of wrath that can be waxed 1 inch from the ground, but he was right up against it. He silently cursed a beetle, which is like pouring water onto a pond. Didn't seem to make any difference, anyway. The beetle plodded away. He cursed a melon unto the 8th generation, but nothing happened. He tried a plague of boils. The melon just sat there, ripening slightly. Just because he was temporarily embarrassed, the whole world had thought it could take advantage. Well, when Ohm got back to his rightful shape and power, he told himself, steps would be taken. The tribes of beetles and melons would wish they had never been created, and something really horrible would happen to all eagles, and there would be a holy commandment involving the planting of more lettuces. By the time the big boy arrived back with the waxy-skinned man, the great god Ohm was in no mood for pleasantries. Besides, from a tortoise-eye viewpoint, even the most handsome human is only a pair of feet, a distant pointy head, and, somewhere up there, the wrong end of a pair of nostrils. What's this? He snarled. This is Brother Numrod, said Brutha, a master of the novices. He is very important. Didn't I tell you not to bring me some fat old pederast? Shouted the voice in his head. Your eyeballs will be spitted on shafts of fire for this. Brutha knelt down. I can't go to the high priest, he said, patiently as possible. Novices aren't even allowed in the great temple except on special occasions. I'd be taught the error of my ways by the Quisition if I was caught. It's the law. Stupid fool, the tortoise shouted. Numrod decided it was time to speak. Novice Brutha, he said, for what reason are you talking to a small tortoise? Because, Brutha paused. Because it's talking to me, isn't it? Brother Numrod looked down at the small, one-eyed head poking out of the shell. He was, by and large, a kindly man. Sometimes demons and devils did put disquieting thoughts in his head, but he saw to it that they stayed there, and he did not, in any literal sense, deserve to be called what the tortoise called him, which, in fact, if he had heard it, he would have thought something to do with feet. What? And he was well aware that it was possible to hear voices attributed to demons and sometimes gods. Tortoises was a new one. Tortoises made him feel worried about Brutha, whom he'd always thought of as an amiable lump who did, without any sort of complaint, anything he asked. Of course, many novices volunteered for cleaning out the cesspits and bull cages, out of a strange belief that holiness and piety had something to do with being up to your knees in dirt. Brutha never volunteered, but if he was told to do something, he did it. Not out of any desire to impress, but simply because he'd been told. And now he was talking to a tortoise. I think I have to tell you, Brutha, he said, that it is not talking. You can't hear it. I cannot hear it, Brutha. It told me that it was. Brutha hesitated. It told me it was the great god. He flinched. Grandmother would have hit him with something heavy now. Ah, well, you see, Brutha, said Brother Numrod, twitching gently. This sort of thing is not unknown among young men recently called to the church. I dare say you heard the voice of the great god when you were called, didn't you? Metaphor was lost on Brutha. He remembered hearing the voice of his grandmother. He hadn't been called so much as sent, but he nodded anyway. And in your enthusiasm, it's only natural that you should think you hear the great god talking to you, Numrod went on. The tortoise bounced up and down. Smite you with thunderbolts, it screamed. I find healthy exercise is the thing, said Numrod, and plenty of cold water. Writhe on the spikes of damnation. Numrod reached down and picked up the tortoise, turning it over. Its legs waggled angrily. How did it get here, I don't know, Brother Numrod, said Brutha dutifully. Your hand to wither and drop off, screamed the voice in his head. There's good eating on one of these, you know, said the Master of Novices. He saw the expression on Brutha's face. Look at it like this, he said. Would the great god Om, holy horns, ever manifest himself in such a lowly creature as this? A bull, yes, of course, an eagle, certainly, but... And I think on one occasion a swan, but a tortoise? Your sexual organs to sprout wings and fly away! After all, Numrod went on, oblivious to the secret chorus in Brutha's head, what kind of miracles could a tortoise do, Your ankles to be crushed in the jaws of giants. Turn lettuce into gold, perhaps, said Brother Numrod, in the jovial tones of those blessed with no sense of humor. Crush ants underfoot? said Brutha dutifully. I shall take it along to the kitchen out of your way, said the Master of Novices. They make excellent soup, and then you'll hear no more voices, depend on it. Fire cures all follies, yes? Soup? Said Brutha. Your intestines to be wound around a tree until you are sorry. Numrod looked around the garden. It seemed to be full of melons and pumpkins and cucumbers. He shuddered. Lots and lots of cold water, that's the thing, he said. Lots and lots. He focused on Brutha again. He wandered off towards the kitchens. The great god Om was upside down in a basket in one of the kitchens, half buried under a bunch of herbs and some carrots. An upturned tortoise will try to right itself firstly by sticking its neck out to its fullest extent and trying to use its head as a lever. If that doesn't work, it will wave its legs frantically in case this will rock it upright. An upturned tortoise is the 9th most pathetic thing in the entire universe. An upturned tortoise who knows what's going to happen to it next is, well, at least up there at number 4. The quickest way to kill a tortoise for the pot is to plunge it into boiling water. Kitchens and storerooms and craftsmen's workshops belonging to the church's civilian population honeycombed the citadel. It takes 40 men with their feet on the ground to keep one man with his head in the air. This was Only one of them, a smoky ceilinged cellar whose focal point was an arched fireplace. Flames roared up the flue. Turnspit dogs trotted in their treadmills. Cleavers rose and fell on the chopping blocks. Off to the side of the huge hearth, among various other blackened cauldrons, a small pot of water was already beginning to seethe. "The worms of revenge to eat your blackened nostrils!" screamed Om, twitching his legs violently. The basket rocked. A hairy hand reached in and removed the herbs. "Hawks to peck your liver!" A hand reached in again and took the carrots. "Afflict you with 1,000 cuts!" A hand reached in and took the great god Om. "The cannibal fungi of—" "Shut up!" hissed Brutha, shoving the tortoise under his robe. He sidled towards the door, unnoticed in the general culinary chaos. One of the cooks looked at him and raised an eyebrow. Just got to take this back," Brutha burbled, bringing out the tortoise and waving it helpfully. "Deacon's orders." The cook scowled and then shrugged. Novices were regarded by one and all as the lowest form of life, but orders from the hierarchy were to be obeyed without question, unless the questioner wanted to find himself faced with more important questions like whether or not it is possible to go to heaven after being roasted alive. When they got out to the courtyard, Brutha leaned against the wall to breathe out. "Your eyeballs to—" the tortoise began. "One more word," said Brutha, "and it's back into the basket." The tortoise fell silent. "As it is, I'll probably get into trouble for missing comparative religion with Brother Welk," said Brutha. "But the great god has seen fit to make the poor man short-sighted, and he probably won't notice that I'm not there. Only if he does, I shall have to say what I've done, because telling lies to a brother is a sin, and the great god will send me to hell for 1,000,000 years." "In this one case, I could be merciful," said the tortoise. "No more than 1,000 years, at the outside." "My grandmother told me I shall go to hell when I die anyway," said Brutha, ignoring this. "Being alive is sinful. Stands to reason, because you have to sin every day when you're alive." He looked down at the tortoise. "I know you're not the great god Om, holy horns, because if I was to touch the great god Om, holy horns, my hands would burn away. The great god would never become a tortoise, like Brother Numrod said. But it says in the book of the prophet Sina that when he was wandering the desert, the spirits of the ground and air spoke unto him. So I wondered if you were one of those." The tortoise gave him a one-eyed stare for a while. Then it said, "Tall fellow, full beard, eyes wobbling all over the place." "What?" said Brutha. "I think I recall him," said the tortoise. "Eyes wobbled when he talked. And he talked all the time to himself. Walked into rocks a lot." "He wandered the wilderness for 3 months," said Brutha. "That explains it then," said the tortoise. "There's not a lot to eat there that isn't mushrooms." "Perhaps you are a demon," said Brutha. "The Septuagint forbids us to have discourse with demons. Yet in resisting demons, says the prophet Fruni, we may grow strong in faith." "Your teeth to abscess with red-hot heat." "Pardon? I swear to me that I am the great god Om, greatest of gods." Brutha tapped the tortoise on the shell. "Let me show you something, demon." He could feel his faith growing if he listened hard. This wasn't the greatest statue of Om, but it was the closest. It was down in the pit level reserved for prisoners and heretics, and it was made of iron plates riveted together. The pits were deserted except for a couple of novices pushing a rough cart in the distance. "It's a big bull," said the tortoise. "The very likeness of the great god Om in one of his worldly incarnations," said Brutha proudly. "And you say you're him?" "I haven't been well lately," said the tortoise. Its scrawny neck stretched out further. "There's a door on its back," it said. "Why is there a door on its back?" "So that the sinful can be put in," said Brutha. Why is there another one on its belly?" "So the purified ashes can be let out," said Brutha. And the smoke issues forth from the nostrils as a sign to the ungodly." The tortoise craned its neck, proud at the rows of barred doors. It looked up at the soot-encrusted walls. It looked down at the now empty fire trench under the iron bull. It reached a conclusion. It blinked its one eye. "People?" it said eventually. "You roast people in it?" "There," said Brutha triumphantly, "and thus you prove you are not the great god. He would know that, of course, we do not burn people in there. Burn people in there? That would be unheard of." "Ah," said the tortoise. "Then what?" It is for the destruction of heretical materials and other such rubbish, said Brutha. Very sensible, said the tortoise. Sinners and criminals are purified by the fire of the Quisitioner's pits, or sometimes in front of the great temple, said Brutha. The great god would know that. I think I must have forgotten, said the tortoise quietly. The great god, Holy Horns, would know that he himself said unto the prophet Walspur, Brutha coughed and assumed the crease-browed squint that meant serious thought was being undertaken. Let the holy fire destroy utterly the unbeliever. That's verse 65. Did I say that? In the year of the lenient vegetable, the bishop Creeblefor converted a demon by the power of reason alone, said Brutha. It actually joined the church and became a subdeacon, or so it is said. Fighting, I don't mind, the tortoise began. Your lying tongue cannot tempt me, reptile, said Brutha, for I am strong in my faith. The tortoise grunted with effort. Smite you with thunderbolts! A very small black cloud appeared over Brutha's head, and a very small bolt of lightning lightly singed an eyebrow. It was about the same strength as a spark off a cat's fur in hot, dry weather. Ouch! Now do you believe me? Said the tortoise. There was a bit of a breeze on the roof of the citadel. It also offered a good view of the high desert. Friet and Druna waited for a while to get their breath back. Then Friet said, Are we safe up here? Druna looked up. An eagle circled over the dry hills. He found himself wondering how good an eagle's hearing was. It certainly was good at something. Was it hearing? It could hear a creature half a mile below in the silence of the desert. The hell's... It couldn't talk as well, could it? Can I trust you? Can I trust you? Friet drummed his fingers on the parapet. And there was the problem. It was the problem of all really secret societies. They were secret. How many members did the turtle movement have? No one knew exactly. What was the name of the man beside you? 2 members knew him, because they would have introduced him, but who were they behind the masks? Because knowledge was dangerous. If you knew, the Inquisition could wind it slowly out of you. So you made sure you didn't know. This made conversation much easier during cell meetings and impossible outside of them. It was the problem of all tentative conspirators throughout history. How to conspire without actually uttering words to be an untrusted possible fellow conspirator, which, if reported, would point the accursing red-hot poker of guilt. The little beads of sweat on Druna's forehead, despite the warm breeze, suggested that the secretary was agonizing along the same lines, but it didn't prove it. And for Friet, not dying had become a habit. He clicked his knuckles nervously. A holy war, he said. That was enough. The sentence included no verbal clue to what Friet thought about the prospect. He hadn't said, Ye God, not a damn holy war. Is the man insane? Some idiot missionary gets himself killed, some man writes some gibberish about the shape of the world, and we have to go to war? If pressed, and indeed stretched and broken, he could always claim that his meaning had been, at last, not a not-to-be-missed opportunity to die gloriously for the one true God, who should trample the unrighteous with hooves of iron. It wouldn't make a lot of difference. Evidence never did once you were in the deep levels where accusation had the status of proof, but at least it might leave 1 or 2 inquisitors feeling like they might just have been wrong. Of course, the church has been far less militant in the last century or so, said Druna, looking out over the desert, much taken up by the mundane problems of the empire. A statement, not a crack in it where you can insert a bone disjointer. There was a crusade against the Hodgsonites, said Friet distantly, and the subjugation of the Melchiorites, and the resolving of the false prophet Zeb, and the correction of the Aeschyleans, and the shriving of the... But that was all just politics, said Druna. Yes, of course, you are right. And of course, no one could possibly doubt the wisdom of a war to further the worship and glory of the great god. No, none could doubt it, said Friet, who had walked across many a battlefield the day after a glorious victory, when you had ample opportunity to see what winning meant. The Omnians forbade the use of all drugs. At times like that, the prohibition bit hard, when you dared not go to sleep for fear of your dreams. Did not the great god declare through the prophet Abbas that there is no greater and more honorable sacrifice than one's own life for the god? Indeed he did, said Friet. Couldn't help recalling that Abbas had been a bishop in the Citadel for 50 years before the great god had chosen him. Screaming enemies had never come at him with a sword. He'd never looked into the eyes of someone who wished him dead. No, of course he had. All the time. Because, of course, the church had its politics. But at least they hadn't been holding the means to that end in their hands the whole time. To die gloriously for one's faith is a noble thing, Druna intoned, as if reading the words off an internal notice board. So the prophet tells us, said Friet miserably. The great god moved in mysterious ways, he knew. Undoubtedly, he chose his prophets. But it seemed as if he had to be helped. Perhaps he was too busy to choose for himself. There seemed to be a lot more meetings, a lot more nodding. A lot more exchanging of glances, even during the services in the Great Temple. Certainly there was a glow about young Vorbis, how easy it was to slip from one thought to the other. There was a man touched by destiny. A tiny part of Friet, the part that had lived for much of its life in tents, had been shot at quite a lot, and had been in the middle of melees where you could just as easily be killed by an ally or an enemy, added. Or at least by something. It was part of him that was due to spend all eternities in all hells, but it already had a lot of practice. You know, I traveled a lot when I was much younger, he said. I have heard you talk most interestingly of your travels in heathen lands, said Druna politely. Often bells are mentioned. Did I ever tell you about the Brown Islands? Out beyond the end of the world, said Druna. I remember. Where bread grows on trees and young women find little white balls and oysters. They die for them, you said, while not wearing a stitch. Something else I remember, said Friet. It was a lonely memory out here with nothing but scrubland under the purple sky. The sea is strong there. There are big waves, much bigger than the ones in the Circle Sea, you understand. And the men paddle out beyond them to fish, on strange planks of wood. And when they wish to return to shore, they wait for the wave, and then they stand up on the wave, and it carries them all the way to the beach. I like the story about the young swimming women best, said Druna. Sometimes there are very big waves, said Friet, ignoring him. Nothing would stop them, but if you ride them, you do not drown. This is something I learned. Druna caught the glint in his eye. Ah, he said, nodding. How wonderful of the great god to put such instructive examples in our path. The trick is to judge the strength of the wave, said Friet, and ride it. What happens to those who don't? They drown, often. Some of the waves are very big. Such is often the nature of waves, I understand. The eagle still circling. If it had understood anything, it wasn't showing it. Useful facts to bear in mind, said Druna, with sudden brightness. If ever one should find oneself in heathen parts. Indeed. I'll say thank you so much. We're about 40 minutes in, so we're going to cut it off here for now. But part 2 of Smaller Gods, we're up to page 43 out of, 350. It's okay. This will take a little while, but you know what? It's been a joy reading this, and I hope you guys enjoy listening to it if you haven't read it yourself. Definitely check out any works by Terry Pratchett, especially those that are part of the Discworld series, because they are fantastic, and I highly recommend them. And I will see you guys next. I would say next chapter, but I really just stop at, like, a break, because this book doesn't technically have chapters. It's okay. See you guys then.